So we now move to the second of our two sessions for today. And what we're looking at here now is a very simple question, but where and how best might a firm deploy design sprints? We've heard a lot about AI, but actually design sprints are much, much wider scenario than that. We think they've covered pretty much any business challenge, as you probably saw from the white paper that we circulated yesterday. So I'm going to invite, first of all, Jeffery, who's going to come and talk about what does it feel like from the managing partner's perspective? What is this? Does this make any difference? Is this something that the managing partners and the leadership team would find useful? Then we're going to go to Becky, who's going to talk about digital transformation, and is this going to help her in her key role as head of digital transformation for Kingston Smith? Then we turn to Rosemary, who is an expert in innovation, saying where does this fit into the innovation landscape and how can this actually help? Marcus is then going to come and talk about that really critical area called teams and how do you actually build a team? Because if you start off any design sprint or indeed any project with a team that doesn't quite work, then the likelihood you'll end up with an optimal project is certainly a lot less. And then we're going to finally finish up with Nigel, who is the Professor of Education at Queen Mary College, but also has a background in learning and development at Reed Smith and other big firms. And he's going to talk about how do you cascade this? It's all very well for the management team to say, yep, that's great. But actually, that's when their job just begins. How do they actually take that knowledge and cascade it down within the organization? Because only when behavior change takes place in the front line, quite frankly, does anything really happen. And we all kind of know that. So I'm going to leave it at that for my quick intro. And I'm going to welcome Ian, who's with Lewis Silkin, has been their managing partner for about 15 years, is now a backed partner, but has a very interesting role. So over to you, sir.
We've heard from our academic colleagues about three things, I suppose. One is around the tools and techniques. The other is the context and scenarios in which those might be applied. And the third, the broad band of applicability, starting with AI readiness, but extending to a much wider set of business challenges. So my job, I think, this afternoon is just to comment on how all of that might be perceived from the perspective of the managing partner or the senior management team. Now, as Richard said, I served quite a long period, 15 years or so, as managing partner of Lewis Silkin, and I think in that time covered off pretty much every regular professional services firm challenge that people have to approach, and quite a few irregular ones as well. Most of the big decisions, pretty much all of the big decisions, get taken in some kind of board or group context. And having had some involvement in this project has made me reflect quite a bit on how we approach those decisions. And I think in many ways, we were very good at the black letter analytical approach to decision making. But not always so good at the creative side of the decision making, the working with ambiguity, the blank sheet of paper, and so on. So, taking a couple of examples of that, if you were looking at the taking on of new office space, we could be very good about defining our financial requirements, our risk, what we wanted to see in the lease documents, and so on, but much less good, perhaps, about thinking of delivering the human experience within the building and creating the best environment for collaboration. We could be very good at designing a new set of associate career development benchmarks, really to get consistency of method and manage the kind of legal and HR risks across the business, but not always so good in delivering a human-centered emotional experience for that generation of talent as they were developing. And maybe even on the client side, really good at extensive text of describing our service offering and refreshing that month in, month out through the various channels, but not always that good at creating the engagement or making sure that the solutions being proposed were right as close as they should be to different client requirements. Now, none of that is to say that we didn't seek or listen to advice on good business design, on the approach to challenges, and that I think the approach we were taking was very much in common with a lot of other firms as they were looking at these challenges. But rather to say, I think particularly with the benefit of the involvement in this project over the last few months and so on, that we didn't always take up the opportunity to apply the most creative methods. There were very few discussions, I think, about scenario hypotheses to draw on some of the material from the previous sessions, and I think almost no instances of the management board working with lo-fi prototypes, and perhaps there should have been. So I guess my take on the relevance of the research that you've been hearing about for the practical tasks in front of PSFs at the moment is really three things. First, if as a result of your experiences and the challenge you've taken on over the last year, you've come to believe not only that your firm can be more creative, but in fact that it must be more creative, how are you going to go about doing that unless it's some change in the way that you approach these kinds of decisions? Second, if you think that there may be a role for more creative approaches to design and to problem solving within your business, how are you going to model and propagate that behavior within the organization if it's not led from the most senior team? And third, if you think there is a case for this kind of methodology and you think that the board needs to be adopting it, what methods have you come across that are more apt for solving creative challenges in a group environment than the kind of ones that have been based on this academic research and described, albeit only an outline to us today? So having posed those three questions, I'll at this point hand over to our next speaker, which
So as with most professional, mid-tier professional firms, I actually wear two hats within the organisation. I'm a partner, a client partner, first and foremost. So I actually am responsible for a portfolio of professional services firms, and therefore delighted to be involved in this project to really help understand the impact that it can have on my clients. But as Richard has already explained, I'm also head of digital transformation for our firm, which involves both working on the firm, as in looking at our own processes and how we can digitally transform them, but also on our clients as well. And I want to talk about technology and its deployment and how using a framework like this that has been designed, how can it make that technology resonate a lot more deeply? So I think if I sort of go back to 10 years or so ago when I was involved in software deployment projects, typically the way that might look would be that a problem was identified for the organisation and we might Google a solution, we might speak to our colleagues, see if anyone was aware of a potential solution to that problem. We might explore our professional network and try and identify other solutions that are out there. We'd probably then email a bunch of consultants or resellers or go directly to software providers and ask for a number of different demos. We'd then obviously evaluate those demonstrations against our budget, probably first and foremost, and obviously an element of functionality. We then probably think about the project and think about what those potential solutions could offer. We then probably think about it a bit more because we're naturally risk adverse, so it's going to take us a bit longer to reach those conclusions. And then in the meantime, probably one of the resellers or consultants who hadn't quite hit their target at that particular time might come back with an offer that was too good to be refused, and we might go for that solution because there wasn't much to choose between them. And for a very narrow technology problem, that still might get you the right answer. You know, there still might be that sort of approach to buying software and technology that works. And that whole approach also assumed that we understood the problem we're trying to solve. I think quite often as well, there's been other projects that I've been involved in that are driven by a sort of desire to keep up with the Joneses, in effect. So looking at technology that our competitors are using and thinking, well, hang on a minute, are we missing out on something? Do we need to explore this opportunity? Again, not necessarily a terrible approach, providing it is a narrow problem. But where we are now and the pressures that are being applied on our respective professions, both regulatory pressures, the productivity gap that is developing, and all of those other external pressures that are being applied to our businesses, is that we have to think much wider about our problems and not take those narrow approaches. And this framework really gives us that ability to do so. I'm right in the middle of a current project where we are using the framework that has been developed exactly within our organisation. And the reason for doing that is it is a wide business problem. We have a specific service line that is a significant service line for our business, and the technology might be part of the answer to how we reimagine that service line, but it certainly isn't all of the answer. And in order to really make this project successful and get the return on investment that we need, a huge part of it is going to be the change management aspects. And again, this project gives you a proper framework to tick off all of those change management things that we all know are really important when carrying on a project like this. But quite often we sort of pay some attention, a bit of lip service to them, but we don't think about them actively and build them into the project framework. So things I'm talking about is an awareness of the need to change. That scenario planning doesn't just look at the awareness and the need to change now and solve a particular problem. It forces you to look much further into the future, such that that change piece will actually future-proof your organisation as well. And the desire to participate and support that change, again, by going through the framework and engaging the right people, you're bringing them on that journey and you're forcing that change management aspect. The knowledge on how to change as well, it's important, again, that technologists are part of the solution, but not all of the solution. So we engage them as we need them, but it's important that it's just not narrowed down to that aspect only. The ability to implement the required sort of skills and behaviours and the reinforcement to sustain the change, this whole part of the framework is around developing the right skills, and other speakers will carry on and talk about all those aspects too. But if we didn't apply this particular framework to the projects that we are currently undertaking, then what we could end up with is narrow pieces of technology that solve part of the problem, but a solution that is not future-proof, does not give us the ability to evolve the process, does not give us the agility to react to any future changes, because maybe the scenario that we imagined needs tweaking as well. And just generally will mean that the project will not resonate as deeply, and therefore we will not get the return on investment that we need. So those are my experiences. As I say, we do go through digital transformation with our clients, and will facilitate these type workshops for them. So I can totally attest to the benefit that they bring, and that sort of fundamental change in the way people engage and look at their business and its future applications.
So firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for being given the opportunity to comment on this really interesting and fascinating piece of work from the perspective of the innovation landscape. I've probably been involved in facilitating various bits of innovation in various different environments for more years than I care to remember. So I think, yeah, it's quite an interesting thing to take a view on. From my perspective, I think that there are a couple of reasons why typically somebody will look to innovation. And it will either be because somebody turns around and says our productivity isn't where it needs to be, something's going on at a sector level and perhaps we can do something differently, make or save some money, or there's sort of this disruptive fear, the fear of the unknown. And I think in the last year we've all seen that there are some fairly unpredictable futures that we don't know about. So typically you'll get asked to do something like create a crowdsourced innovation program for 27,000 people, or set up some design sprints, or go and have a look at whether or not we need an incubator or an accelerator, or in my latest exciting challenge, working with higher education to look at the future innovation space. And all of it throws up a number of questions. Is there leadership alignment? And typically at the point that somebody's thinking about innovation, there's something happened in the sector that has driven an organisation to think about this, and the leadership will say, yeah, okay, we all agree that's a threat. Is there an organisational opportunity? And therefore, is there the willingness to invest on that particular level in terms of the organisation in question? Now, given all those things have been answered, you then come to that really easy part, which is the delivery, right? Okay, no problem there. But actually, that's where the layers of complexity start. You know, you would think the other things are complex, and trying to do anything without them in place introduces complexity. But actually, when you actually look down at what is the problem, you quite often then find that people turn to trying to solutionise. So they don't really think what's the problem in very clear and concise statements. They either go down a rabbit hole or they really are unable to articulate. They find it very difficult to perhaps translate that sometimes into a business need, let alone into a technology enablement requirement. And furthermore, you know, when you look at the art of the possible, based on the potential between where you are and where you could be based on what's out there in the marketplace at sector level, it becomes really difficult for people to understand how you apply those scenarios to their own organisations. So when I had a look at this piece of work, I found it really absolutely fascinating. And for me, there's sort of three really big takeaways that resonate. Firstly is around the applicability of design sprints themselves as a fantastic tool to enable collaboration. And I think, you know, the key thing that I would say here is around the way that you can bring clients, the supply chain, technology experts, people from all across the organisation, irrelevant of hierarchy, to really come together and creatively work using this toolkit and some of these techniques around thinking about the solution to the particular problem. And it can help you frame the problem and look at the solution for the problem. So I think it becomes a really practical, really useful, really collaborative toolkit. And I think that is something that is much needed in this space. I think secondly is around the recognition on skills. I think it was Bruce who sort of said this is about organisational insurance, and I really like that term. But, you know, when we talk about futurists or creative strategists, it quite often sounds like a job title or an activity that is very far removed from our day-to-day world. But actually being able to vision and think about the future and your place in it is really important. And you know, something I've often observed over the last few decades of work is that the knowledge curation around markets, clients, even on organisations themselves is typically quite poor. And therefore the baseline for innovation on an organisational level is quite challenging. So when you bring these design sprints groups together and you have creative strategies and futurists and scenarios as part of it, you introduce a really new set of skills and a different set of thinking. And I think that's the second takeaway for me about how critical that really is. And I think that once you've built that capability in-house, and whether that is somebody that you contract to or whether it really genuinely is somebody that you have in-house, you suddenly have that ability to form an innovation roadmap. And I think Richard said earlier, you know, this is far wider in terms of its applicability than just the potential introduction of one advanced technology that happens to be AI. You know, this methodology can go beyond that. So it becomes scalable and repeatable. And therefore, in terms of actually making that investment in this methodology and the skills to enable it, it becomes really worthwhile. And I think for me, that third takeaway, therefore, is around the ability to actually drive the adoption and the embedding of any innovation as part of a business model. You know, if I look back over lots of the different projects that I've been involved with, quite often they'll become something that happens alongside the main organisation, and actually integrating the solution into the larger organisation becomes a new complex challenge in itself. And so I think this methodology actually gives you a guidance, this framework around how you can drive this as part of a business model. And for me, that's really critical because that starts to close that gap between the potential and the reality of anything when it comes to innovation. So in this case, it's AI, what's the potential, what's the reality of it in an organisation. But it could equally be other things, such as randomly, let's talk about the property world, the use of drones for surveying. We all know that drones fly around. How many of them are used in surveying? It's increasing massively, but the potential is huge. So, lots and lots of examples that we could cite about potential versus reality against lots and lots of advanced technologies. And I think with those three takeaways around the design sprints themselves, the skills, and that bringing it into a business model approach, it will lead to success, and that leads to impact, which therefore leads to productivity and growth. And ultimately, I think that's the aim of the outcome of the project. So, yeah, absolutely brilliant to have had the opportunity to read this and comment on it. So thank you very much.
Talking about teams, today's event is titled Fast Track Innovation. Now, when we say innovation, we instantly think digital, technology, tools, robots, automation. And in fact, we're focused today on AI, artificial intelligence. So it must be about technology, right? That's what innovation's about. Well, that's wrong. Innovation does not equal technology, despite what we all think and perceive. Innovation's about people. And as we've talked about a lot throughout today, it's about how do we enable these people, our own people in organizations, to take this to the next level and enable us to face the challenges that are approaching us every day. And why is that? The challenges we're facing today in what's called this VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, means that what we're actually facing is revolution, not evolution. Everything's happening too fast. The pace of change is accelerating daily. And these challenges are not letting up. Every single day, we only have to read the press and see that there's something else causing pain and problems for businesses and organizations across the globe. Now, the upside of COVID is something we need to capitalize on, because in 2020, we actually achieved in 6 months what would have normally taken 6 years to do from a digital transformation perspective in business, because we were forced to work remotely, forced to use the digital capabilities that exist out there. Companies are rapidly accelerated their programs that would have taken many more years to facilitate and achieve that outcome. So when we're looking at new ways of working, to deal with these challenges using the design thinking and design sprints process that we've talked about today, we need to ensure we have the right people in the right roles, because you may have a fantastic framework, you may have a fantastic tool or process, but if you don't have the right people, the right team established, then having that tool is no use whatsoever. It's like having an amazing skilled plumber and giving them a dreadful bag of old tools that you've had for years that just aren't going to cut it. So how do we enable that team? How do we make sure that they're ready and prepared for these challenges that we're facing? Well, Bruce Tuckman talked about forming, storming, norming, and performing. Obviously, that's something, the stages that a normal team goes through when they're coming together and then becoming a high-performing team. And they'll go through those stages multiple times and, cyclical, as they continue to learn new things. And what we're trying to achieve here is creating the sum of the parts is greater than the individuals. Some examples where I've worked in large-scale transformations in banks, where we've had some very highly skilled technical teams who are brought together to do a program of development and delivery. All think they know what they know, and they all think they're experts in their own areas, and they'll come together and crack on with doing what they're doing. But they're not working as a team. They've not spent that time to bond, to fuse together, to understand the problem and the challenges. And therefore, over time, they start to fail. They don't deliver as effectively as the perception is that they could, because they're experts. They're awesome. Why do they need to be more coached, more supported? And therefore, the teams that have come together and actually bonded first and formed and come together to understand their individual capabilities, their skill sets, and in particular, the soft skills. We very much focus on the hard skills when we're doing development and delivery. We need to focus on soft skills, so we have that understanding of the team, the empathy, and especially in these days of remote working. How do we use those soft skills and our people skills to enable that team to become more effective as a group? And that's what we do. We provide support in helping these teams engaging in this framework, this design sprint framework that's really, really effective if you have the right people in. And it's not only with ways of adopting this new way of working, but it's with adopting the different ways of thinking that come with it. As again, what we tend to see is 21st century technologies and ways of working have been accompanied with 20th century ways of thinking. So we've got to move that thinking and mindset shift, hence why design thinking, critical thinking to pair up with these new tools that work very well when you have that combination. Now, helping the formation of the team with the right people and the skills enabling those teams to understand the skills, adopt them, and effectively understand the challenges that they're facing before they leap into that delivery. So we're going to go through some test and learn, experimentation on hypotheses, so we really understand what the problem is we're trying to solve. Because, I think Becky mentioned earlier, so many people solutionize, so many people jump into those instant answers. We know what we need, just get on with it and fix it and build it. And then 3, 6, 12 months in, we've built the wrong thing. We've designed the wrong, outcome. So it's really important to take the time up front, slow down at first to speed up downrange is one of the mantras that works really well in this design thinking concept. And with this, you have a capability that's internal. You've got your own internal people upskilled. You don't have to pay a fortune on external consultants coming in, who all they're going to do is ask the questions that you can ask your teams yourselves. The answers lie within. And what this capability, this framework does is allows you to surface those answers using the right processes, the right questions to go through that problem. And then ultimately what happens then is you've got this internal capability, teams with skill sets that are fungible, i.e. transferable amongst different areas. You've got cross capabilities across the team and across multiple teams where you may have other dependencies. And at the end of the day, that's going to allow you to adapt, survive and thrive in this complex and uncertain world that we're facing into. And obviously in a world where the rise of robots is at the forefront of everyone's mind, we still need to keep people in the loop. So by having the right framework with the right teams and the right ways of working accompanied by ways of thinking, we're going to be able to empower and enable our people to have that capability shift in the right direction.
So as you said, Richard, it was really just to share a few thoughts on, you say, sprint's been carried out. We've got all these ideas. We've got a plan. How do we turn insight into action? I think, as you often say, Richard. And for me, just echoing a lot of what's just been said, Ian, you said this, Becky and Marcus too, this thought around the human side of things, because this is what I was working with over sort of many years in different law firms, where a lot of the work I was doing was actually around how can we push things forwards and be a change agent, actually, for lots of things we've been trying. So I just wanted to think briefly about the cascading point, as you say, Richard. How do we cascade this and build momentum? I think momentum's the key word here. How do we do this? So I thought we could think about the why, the what, the who, and the how. So I just want to touch on each of those just for about a minute or so and just share a couple of thoughts on each. So if we're thinking about cascading and almost deciding on the focus, and we've heard a lot about when we've iterated our ideas, we've gone through the method, we've got a plan. So there's something here for me about the prioritization that leads to what's going to have the biggest impact on client service and the team effectiveness. And if we can prioritize, I always think this is a great way of almost getting the message through the organization, of cascading that message down of this is why we're going about this. This is why it's really important to us. It might have come through client feedback, and we've touched on that this afternoon as well. We might even involve clients not only in the iteration process, but then perhaps as part of an advisory board as we go through the next phase. That's a great way of maintaining momentum, I've always found. If you can have that outside, that external input into the change processes you're trying to go through as well. Okay, if we move on to the what, so we could think of almost, what is the another opportunity to cascade things, I think, is defining the goalposts. And I think the design thinking method, I think, helps us here, because it's this constant iterative process. We're not just setting one goal that's then fixed and that's what we stick with. But actually, it's a great way of getting key stakeholders on side with a project. Again, the human aspect of change here, letting people co-create the goals. So I think as we cascade, as we try and turn stuff into action, as we try and build momentum, get rid of inertia, which, as we know, organizationally is often the status quo. That's what's going to want to happen organizationally. We need to get beyond that. So if we can co-create goals as we go through the iteration process, that's a lovely way of getting people on side, getting their voices heard, and all the things we've been hearing about this afternoon. And moving on to the people, which I just touched on, we could think about the who as well. So who's going to be involved in leading change? And I think Marcus, Becky, Rosemary and Ian, you just touched on a number of these points. I'm a big fan of of the change house, that famous model from the 1970s from Klaus Janssen. And he said, you need to think about the population you're working with. Are they in the room of contentment? Are they in the room of denial, confusion, or renewal? And it's almost that change curve, that famous Kubler-Ross change curve that we often go through. And so if we're needing to work with the people and needing, again, to think about how do we cascade, analysing the human side of actually what's going to help us build momentum here as we go through the project and go through perhaps our next iteration in our next sprint and implement the sprint, then thinking about where the population is in their heads is a really, really important thing. Again, with my coach training, we're always told to be on the other person's agenda. So we need to think about where their heads are. And also that could be not just internally, it could be the clients as well. And again, it's not just the fee earners either. It's the business services teams. It's all the critical members of the firm as well as has been highlighted earlier. And just lastly, on the how, and in terms of how we cascade and how we think about that, I think my tip there would be, let's think about different methods. I used techniques such as reverse mentoring. And so in the past, and I'm thinking, how can we actually cascade things so that actually people feel a sense of involvement, they feel a sense of buy-in, they all the way up and down the organization, we have this sense of co-creation of where we're trying to get to. They understand the benefits, they've actually thought about the ideas themselves. How can we make it feel flat as an organization to let all the ideas easily percolate up and down? And that famous phrase of psychological safety as well. So within the team structures, can we think of ways in terms of perhaps there's some leadership skills we need to develop, or perhaps our leaders are already great at this, but how can we make team meetings just feel that nice, open, safe space where we can ask any question? We did an exercise with one leadership group once where we just had this thought of who speaks first in your team meetings, and actually where are ideas allowed to come from? So again, if we can cascade, Richard, I think, and just think about the who as well, then I think there's something there about getting momentum going from almost the collective wisdom of the crowd through both within the firm and the organization, but also from our clients as well.